Hello, good afternoon, and welcome. My name is Gillian Parker. I sit on the Policy and Insights team at Economist Impact here in Singapore. And we're here today to discuss the critical topic of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And today I'd like to welcome on stage our panelists. Paolo Domondan, Chief Programme Officer from Global Fishing Watch. Welcome, thank you for joining us. Wes Norris, Chief Executive of Australian Fisheries Management Authority. Thank you so much for joining us today. And Andy Hovey, Chief Product Officer from Starboard Maritime Intelligence. And joining us online virtually is Narashima Murthy, Senior Executive Director from the National Fisheries Development Board in India. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. So illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing is a problem all countries across the region face, and the related harmful practices such as human rights violations, the lack of traceability across supply chains, and limited data tracking, amongst others, is damaging ocean health. It also has all the hallmarks of organised crime. It's an extremely serious issue to tackle. Before we get into the discussion about IUU fishing, we'd like to first share a video message on an important and closely related topic, and that's fisheries subsidies. And that comes from Santiago Wills, Director from the Council and Trade Negotiations Division and former Chair of the Fisheries Subsidies Negotiations at the World Trade Organization.
Hello, and greetings to all participants of the World Ocean Summit Asia Pacific. My name is Santiago Wills, and I'm the former chair of the Fisheries Subsidies Negotiations at the World Trade Organization. As the agenda of this summit underscores, the Asia Pacific is the region that is perhaps the most vulnerable to climate change and ocean degradation, being heavily dependent on the seas for food provision and economic development. According to the FAO, more than two-thirds of the world's fish are harvested in the Asia-Pacific region. In addition, more than 90% of the region's fishers are small-scale fishers, most of whom depend on the fishing sector for their livelihoods. Thus, the ocean is of deep importance, not only to your economies, but also to the livelihood of your people. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to address you today on this key topic of sustainable ocean economy, and particularly to highlight the importance of the recent WTO Fisheries Subsidies Agreement for the sustainability of our oceans and marine fisheries. The negotiations at the WTO to prohibit harmful fisheries subsidies started over 20 years ago in 2001. They were given added impetus in 2015 when the UN adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, including SDG 14, to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources. Target 14.6 specifically gave the mandate to the WTO to conclude such negotiations. Momentum was built since then, and it led to the WTO's 12th Ministerial Conference, MC12, held in Geneva on June this year, where WTO members delivered on the mandate in SDG Target 14.6 by adopting a multilateral agreement on fisheries subsidies. This agreement is in a way historic, as it is the first SDG target to be met, the first SDG target met through a multilateral agreement, and the first WTO agreement with a core focus on sustainability. This is a big achievement for the WTO, but more importantly, this is a major step forward for ocean sustainability, as the agreement prohibits some of the most harmful fisheries subsidies, which are a key factor in the widespread depredation of the world's fish stocks. This agreement will help in global efforts to preserve our oceans and reverse the depressing decline in fish stocks that threatens the ocean environment and the communities that depend on fishing for food and livelihood. You know better than anyone that the world's ocean faces enormous challenges. One of the most fundamental is the dramatic deterioration in global fish stocks, which continues unabated. By some measures, nearly half of assessed fish stocks are overfished, down from 10% in the 70s and about 18% in 2001 when these negotiations began. Not only does this decline have huge repercussions for marine ecosystems and thus the global environment, it also has grave consequences for millions of people around the world whose livelihoods and food security depend on fishing. The new agreement thus seeks to eliminate and prohibit subsidies contributing to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, to prohibit subsidies to fishing stocks that are already overfished, and to prohibit subsidies for fishing in the unregulated high seas. Just as important, the transparency and notification requirements in the new agreement will greatly improve data on fisheries, on subsidies, and on vessels caught fishing illegally. Bringing some badly needed transparency to the murky world of illegal fishing won't just end the subsidies they get, it will also help identify the culprits and help governments end the support they give to them. In addition, to help developing country members and least developed country members implement the new rules and to help them improve their fisheries management, a funding mechanism, what we call the Fish Fund, has been established to provide technical assistance and capacity building. This is also a first, and it is my great pleasure to share with you that the fund is now open to receive donations. The agreement on fisheries subsidies is a great achievement, but for the new disciplines to have a real-world impact and for WTO members to implement it, the agreement must enter into force. And for this to happen, 2/3 of WTO members must deposit their instruments of acceptance with the WTO. I thus strongly encourage leaders of Asia-Pacific countries to do so quickly so that the new rules can enter into force, protecting our fish and the livelihoods of those who depend on them. Furthermore, the WTO is not going to stop negotiations here. Members agreed to a second wave of negotiations with a view to enhancing the new rules, with further disciplines on subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. With so many technically complex and politically sensitive issues already covered by the new agreement, these negotiations will be able to focus on outstanding issues, and I expect they will deliver a result by the next WTO Ministerial Conference. I see this agreement helping pave the way for a more prosperous, resilient, and sustainable Asia-Pacific region. Again, and regretting not being able to be in person with you today, I thank you for this opportunity and for your attention. I'm honored to have been invited to share with you this message on the important role that WTO is playing on ocean sustainability.
Okay, and thank you, Ambassador Wills, for that message. It took 20 years of negotiations, and I'm sure it's still a work in progress. Perhaps now would be a good time to let's take a quick pulse survey from our audience. Will the WTO agreement be successful in prohibiting subsidies to IUU fishing in Asia Pacific? So you have your flashcards, yes, no. You can wave it if you're not quite sure. Oh, I've got a few waves, oh dear, okay. Right, maybe still some work to do. I think we knew the answer to that one maybe already. I mean, Wes, let's start with you. The legal fishing industry is by its nature highly secretive. It's intertwined with geopolitical competition, especially in Asia. How will these regulations be enforced?
Yeah, thanks very much, and that's a great question. To take a step back a little bit, it's fantastic that the instrument's been negotiated, an agreement's been reached. Next challenge is to get it to come into force, and then the challenge after that is to make it work properly. And as with any other international agreement, it will rely on the parties to the agreement to implement it in good faith. So it will rely on each party exercising the proper discipline that we are signing up to do to assess our fisheries and look for IUU implications, and to assess our subsidies programs and look for interactions between the two and take action. Secondly, it'll rely on those transparency provisions. We as a global community, in fisheries at least, are not very good at holding each other to account. We negotiate all these conventions and resolutions and measures. Many of them have compliance mechanisms in place, but we're not very good at implementing them in a way that has a meaningful constraint on untoward behaviours. And that's what that second round of negotiations really needs to get into, I think.
I mean, let's unpick that a little bit. Why do governments consider IUU to be a key security threat?
I think the growing importance of fisheries and to security is not about changes in fisheries, it's about changes in the way that a lot of governments view the broad construct of security. So elements that have always been important in the past but aren't necessarily in that traditional view of sort of border protection and sovereignty protection are growing in importance now. Food security, resource security, economic security, information security. And fisheries is an industry that goes across all of those elements. It's important to all of those, and so that's why it's of growing importance to the security construct. Equally, as you said before, fishing vessels and fishing fleets can be vectors of security threats themselves, and so you've got this situation where fisheries can contribute positively towards protecting national security, but at the same time they pose specific risks that need to be managed.
Thank you for that. Andy, perhaps for people who are maybe less familiar with what IUU looks like, what are some of the behaviours when you're trying to identify this trend and then decrease it, essentially?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's an incredibly complex world. There's a big variance across the globe between illegal, which is essentially fishing without the appropriate license, unreported, which you've said you've caught an amount of fish, but you've actually caught more than you've said, in unregulated areas where it's not well monitored, the behaviour, and the issues that people are looking for, and certainly what our customers and analysts are looking for, really varies. Maybe just to jump into a story of what a day-to-day life might look for, or imagine that you're looking across the Pacific. Relevant to us here, there's tens of thousands of vessels, there's thousands of fishing vessels out there. In one area, off the Marshall Islands, an analyst identifies that a vessel has been deploying fishing equipment in a closed period, a FAD, a type of device that is used. That same fishing vessel down the line displays a movement that looks like it's met another vessel, that it's transshipped its catch, but that transshipment event doesn't line up with what's being reported. And then further down the line, maybe that vessel turns up in Micronesia, and that's its next port of call. And you've talked about the interconnected nature of fishing. Maybe there's another analyst who's looking at this vessel and who owns this vessel. And so now you've created this kind of combination of events. Some have been flagged by an algorithm, some have been flagged by an analyst movement, some are potential illegal activity. And all of those events need to be catalogued against that vessel. And when this person in Micronesia has this vessel coming into port, they need to be able to look at all of that information, and there needs to be the data sharing policies in place, the approach to transparency, so when this person in Micronesia is looking at this arriving vessel, they have its entire history and picture and the benefit of all of the previous work and the collaboration from these other nation states. So when they go on to inspect it, they can look at the plotter, and they can look at the hold, where the temperature has fluctuations that maybe don't marry up with where this vessel has met another. And then if need be, they can follow up with the flag state, they can pursue prosecution. And so all of these things kind of need to work together and are enabled by data sharing, enabled by transparency to ultimately kind of reduce the behaviour. But that is an incredible web of parties that need to come together basically to achieve that.
I mean, is that the biggest downfall, I mean, the roadblock to progress, that you're really relying on quite a tricky web of actors that are not always on the best speaking terms, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it's partially that. It's also partially, I mean, I don't think there was a confident yes in the audience when you asked the question before about the reduction in subsidies. And I think that, go back to the chap in Micronesia who's looking at the port that's arriving. There undoubtedly will be legislation that says that this vessel shouldn't be allowed to do this behaviour on the high seas because they're supported by some subsidy. But how does that information get to that vessel? And how does the information attached to that vessel gets to the inspector in Micronesia so they can, it's challenging to share this information to the right people at the right time and have the tools to analyse it, basically.
Thank you. Just continuing on that thread, Narasimha, thanks so much for joining us. The Indian Ocean, it's become a hotly contested area for competing fishing industries with accusations about illegal trawling coming from several directions. How do you go about resolving these disputes? Tell us a little bit about your approach in dealing with the IUU fishing as a national security threat.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone. In India, we have almost like 8,200 kilometer coastline. It's a huge one. So we have maritime states, including 4 union territories. Issues with union territories and other states are entirely different. So even though we have 2-3 issues with Pak Strait, with Sri Lanka, and Rana of Kutch and Bay of Bengal when it comes to IUU. So Government of India, even though we have so many mechanized, motorized and non-motorized vessels we have, but Government of India has taken maximum care to avoid, to make fishing is more sustainable in India. At least from last 10 years, if you take, the lot of precautionary measures has taken. So, a lot of research has, transferred to this fishermen to understand this shoal of the fish and fear that and all those things. So when it comes to measures, so we have, we had our own regulation fishing of foreign vessels. We have Marine Fishing Regulation Act, MFRA, we have, then Merchant Shipping Act, then biometric identity to cost to marine fishers, national policy for the marine fisheries, then guidelines from time to time to regulate of Indian fishing vessels. So territorial water, yes, some more clarity on the demarcation of the territorial waters so that it can avoid IUU fishing in our neighboring states. Then Maritime Zones of India Act should be implemented properly. We are working on that. Then nowadays, the lot of power is given to coastal guards also to identify these areas and to identify this, fishing vessels which moves, our territorial waters and even outside vessels in our territorial waters. Then other than that, we have, Council of Law, like United Nations Council of Law and Order. So we have sovereign right, we have establishment of use of artificial islands, installations and structures, then marine scientific research, protection and preservation of marine environment. Then we have regional institutions like Bay of Bengal working very closely with all the states. Then Indian Ocean Tuna Commission we have separately for that. Then Indian Ocean Rim Association. So by considering all these things, Government of India is taking maximum care to minimize this IUU fishing. So we have strengthening the institutional and regional international organizations. Then we have
I think we might have lost you there. You might have gone on mute.
yeah. I'm audible now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. So foreign fleets largely avoid the national and international regulatory approaches. Then many countries have long faced threats of IUU fishing. Now there is a growing threat in Indian Ocean also. Regulations, appropriate measures for the nets to avoid the catching juvenile fish, database management of the fishing vessel statistics and catch data. In addition to that, in government of other organizations, we have like catch certificate from Marine Products Development Authority, where, which particular area, particular vessel has, caught that fish and what are the depth, what are the issues, including in marine pollution related issues. Also, we are collecting data. So we are working very closely with all the states, maritime states, to avoid this, IUU fishing, mostly on sustainable things. When it comes to subsidy, India, from beginning, we are not that much interested in the subsidy thing. But since we have the small and marginal fishermen for the livelihood, we are little bit on the subsidy scale. Otherwise, slowly we are reducing this. So when it comes to sustainability, Government of India working with many research organizations to make some more modern equipments to understand the fish hole or like potential fishing zone, and to make very easy for the fishing to our farmers. This is from India side. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a lot of interesting insights there. And I mean, the sort of the key part of all of this seems to be cooperating and working together. Perhaps another aspect of this is increasing transparency. Paolo, and I'll ask you about this because this is your field in Global Fishing Watch, working with the governments and agencies to increase transparency. We will go to a more detailed conversation on tech in a second, but how important is the transparency and data in addressing IUU? And are we seeing any sort of sizable shifts?
So transparency as a principle and as a pillar of good governance, regardless of sector, regardless of governance levels, is critical. It drives accountability, it pushes participation in decision-making processes, and if done well, if accessible enough, we will be able to also address equity. I've been watching some of the plenary sessions as well, and I heard Minister Balakrishnan talk about transparency, not just for the oceans, during the COP for UNFCCC, for the CBD COP that's happening next week. We need to drive accountability so that we could have a foundation to hold stakeholders accountable to their actions. I was just in a 4-hour session on small-scale fisheries, and we were also talking about transparency, the importance of it. And I don't want to romanticize it. It is a critical one, but it is very tricky. So, especially for the ocean space, it is so important because it is a public good. Not a lot of people yet still know what's happening. And at the same time, we're facing the issue of tragedy of the commons. But imagine the possibility that if everybody is indeed transparent, may it be in terms of data, may in terms of information, or the policies that govern us, we will be able to help change the behaviors of individual vessels because of deterrence effect. We will be able to help inform and influence policies because everybody is now seeing the data that's being used to inform those policies. And then we will also be able to have common understanding globally, internationally, and regionally. And we will be able to also change systems. And I think because there is an opportunity to latch on to this, and I just love how transparency has picked up over the years. I've been following all these different negotiations, even the WTO, for many years now. Because the transparency is something that we can do. There are now a lot of mechanisms for us to be able to do this. Then it's something that we must.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Paolo. Moving to you, Andy, I mean, technology is, of course, a critical component of any effort to fight IUU fishing. As the chief of product, or where you are, you work with governments to deploy the technology that's needed. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the technologies that governments around the region are deploying? Are you seeing governments investing in these tools and then following through with action in the event of a violation?
Yeah, I think that there's kind of two sides to the increasing volume of technology that's deployed. I mean, again, it's very variable across the globe, but as the volume of vessels which are tracked goes up, which is a great thing, and as Paolo talked about before, looking at the increasing tracking the volume of artisanal fishing fleets across the world, that's a great foundation to help us sustainably manage fisheries. We need to understand what's going on so we can map species health. But related to IUU fishing, what you end up with is this phenomenal volume of data, far too much data for a human to make sense of. And so, if we're talking about reducing the volume of IUU fishing and having governments and intergovernmental organizations, regional fishery management organizations, being able to identify when this is going on, they also need to deploy data science methods and employ cloud computing and other things, which enables you to go from this literally hundreds of thousands of vessels in the world to identifying vessels that are doing either clearly illegal activity if it's unlicensed, or activity that's worthy of following up. And then coupled with this tracking technology is the use of technologies which enables you to detect and potentially one day identify vessels that are not reporting their locations. And so this is the growing use of satellite data and other kind of technologies. And so it's kind of a combination of vessel tracking plus monitoring areas for potential non-reporting vessels, plus having the analysis capability that you can sift through literally big data. It's an expression that's used too often, but in the maritime space, we really are talking about big data to help analysts and nations direct, which is inevitably limited resources to focus on the vessels and the activities that do actually matter and the ones that they can take through to prosecution.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be an aspect, Paolo, of the governance and the transparency issue. How do you begin to build that skill set within a government? You know, sort of, not everyone is going to be qualified to deal with these reams and reams of big data. Surely that's a massive part of this puzzle in governance.
So there's a lot of challenges with technology. So capacity building for users should be one of those. Technology transfer could be another one to be able to address these challenges. There's political willingness to be able to use this. But I think one of the biggest challenges, and maybe also the biggest opportunity with regards to technology, is being able to bridge the possibilities of technology and innovation and bridge that to the greatest needs. So we're not just creating technology for the technology's sake, but we're creating technology to be able to address the core objectives, either of governments, of communities, of local fishers. And I think that's like the sweet spot that we should be aiming for.
Wes, just going back to the sort of the challenges around this space, where do you see the biggest challenges in adopting surveillance technology to rein in this issue?
Yeah, it really is that capacity piece. There is not a single government in the world, there's not a single NGO in the world, there's not a single part of the private sector in the world that can do this by themselves. So it really does have to be that collaborative effort through regional, sub-regional groupings, like-minded partnerships and so on, to be able to sort of get that critical mass and build capacity amongst a group where it makes sense, as opposed to everybody trying to build their own capacity. And you know, that's been done really successfully in some parts of the world. The Pacific's a great example through the Foreign Fisheries Agency, where they have, you know, a single vessel register for all tuna vessels fishing in the region, a single vessel monitoring system, a centralised observer program, data collection and so on. Whereas individually, none of those 17 countries could have achieved that by themselves. With the growth of big data and more technology and things like that, the private and civil sector becomes far more important because, again, you know, particularly if you're talking about a group of developing countries, there simply isn't the resources to invest in, you know, some of that sort of blue sky research, which may come to nothing or may come to an incredibly groundbreaking solution. And so that's where that wider focus outside of just governments needs to come in.
I mean, is it difficult to sort of encourage investment in this space? What do you think is really holding back investment?
I think it's difficult to focus investment more than anything.
Yeah.
Traditionally, governments haven't been transparent. They've been, you know, even governments that are good at sharing data within themselves and sharing information with other governments haven't necessarily been very good at saying, you know, okay, here's a private provider, we're going to give you all of our tracking data for the last 20 years, see what you can do with it, please. So I think it's more about that building relationships of trust, getting some wins on the board and being able to provide the information.
Thank you. Narasima, where have you seen some success in using technology where you are, and where do you see the challenges? Oh, sorry, we still can't hear you. I think you might be on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Government of India, like potential fishing zone, we are working with most of the research institutes. We are transferring all the information to the fishermen where they can identify the chlorophyll pigments as well as the shoal. So that this gives at least they will reach the particular ground where the minimum fishes are available, they can catch and bring back. So some area, actually, Government of India has taken a lot of interest to work with the fishermen. I mean, to get the at least minimum catch when they go for the fishing, especially multi-day fishing. So when previous speakers also spoke about transparency, I have few points to just highlight on transparency. So strengthening of regional and institutional organization, so it is very helpful. It will avoid duplicating the efforts taken by the other countries against common threats, while enhancing its role in these regimes and organizations. That is very important for us. Then highlighting the incidents of IUU fishing so that we can assist the government in its policy making at both our domestic and global levels. Then disseminating the information on the foreign vessels present in the EEZ so that understanding the nature and regulation impact of IUU also will be very important. So in addition to that, we have other government corporations, we can have the management of shared stocks so that, I mean, disseminating the information will be very important for to understand the thing, what is going around the world. Then safety at sea, then monitoring and control surveillance, then spatial planning. Yes, Government of India is thinking in big way in that area. Then management of key habitats, marine pollution is one thing, then climate change. So when it comes to technology, now we have a lot of, our Indian organizations, research organizations working to, equip with the modern equipments for the fishermen, whether it's a marginal fisherman or in the trawlers. Then in addition to that, satellite pictures are, the information is, disseminated to the fish farmers, fishermen to understand the thing so that they can have some sustainable fisheries. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think communicating, how you communicate why this is important. I mean, we focus a lot on supply chains, economist impact, for instance, as a part of our research. And some of these concepts just don't translate in some markets. I mean, there's no word for human rights in Vietnam, for instance. You know, in some countries, the concept of an ethnic minority just isn't there. These are quite complicated aspects to try and communicate to, you know, how do you begin to tackle that? Is that something that is even on your radar when you're trying to tackle this issue?
So I think it's about what Wes has mentioned. We can't do it alone. We really have to work with everybody. We have to work with governments across all different levels. We have to work with civil society. We have to work with communities. So that addresses and gets like our message across to various different contexts. I mean, we support, for example, the Global Transparency Coalition, which is pushing transparency principles for vessels and to help address IUU. I mean, we support, for example, the creation of the Joint Analytical Cell, working with other tech platforms or tech-based organizations to address IUU. We support networks of governments like the IUU Action Alliance. And if we actually operate in all these levels and all across different sectors, then language, context, etc., hopefully we'll be able to see through.
Thank you. I think we can take a couple of questions from the floor if anyone would like to. We've got a roving mic, the lady in the back row.
Hello, this is a question for Mr. Murthy in India. You know that so many fishing vessels go across the territorial waters into Sri Lanka's waters with massive trawlers. And they're fishing in Sri Lanka's waters from those very poor, impoverished fishermen that we have in the north. So on the one hand, you're saying you're going to support Sri Lanka, and on the other hand, you're fishing in our waters and taking away their livelihoods. How do you account for that, given all of what you've heard today?
Yeah, it's a good question. We have, few issues with Sri Lanka. That is, again, I think already I mentioned in my talk. So demarcations of the territorial waters is one thing. Then giving power to the coastal guards to identify the thing and make amicably fishing things. So nowadays, almost all the boats, I mean, all the vessels in India, we are equipped with GPS. So now, slowly the issues are, resolving. By understanding the territorial waters and our own things, I think we can solve that issue. So nowadays it's reduced. So this is my opinion.
All you're doing is basically depleting all the fish stocks on Sri Lanka's side, because there is no fish stocks in your side. So I think, for what it's worth, because all that happens, I mean, Sri Lanka is a tiny little country. We do not have the power to fight with India. And I think it's all very well for you to talk in these conferences and talk about all the things you're doing, but actually you're plundering your neighbor's door and you're impoverishing very poor people in the north of Sri Lanka. And I would say to you that it's good business relations, good neighborly relations, and then good for the planet if you actually control all those. You can see it in the morning satellites. Hundreds of that fish, massive boats come across. And our Navy is unable to do anything. And unfortunately, nobody else seems to ever care about this.
I think this is where we see the issues with enforcement and the reality of trying to enforce some of these treaties and everything that we see, putting paper into practice. Perhaps we could take another question. Thank you for your points there. Yes, this gentleman here on the...
Yeah, shall I answer one point?
Yes, certainly.
10 seconds, yeah. It's not like fighting each other and all those things, but still, we can understand that feeling. But now the government of India has taken a lot of initiative. This issue with Sri Lanka. So I think easily we can come out with the solutions. So we need not bother much. I think we are working on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Masanori from Ocean Policy Research Institute of the Sakai Peace Foundation, Japan. Yeah, I understand that this satellite-based data has been effectively used to support the monitoring of fishing vessels in a fishing ground. But I just wondered if you can comment on whether this satellite-based data has been effectively shared actually with the port authorities to stop like IUU fishing vessels or like transport vessels or even transshipment activities to eliminate IUU fishing. I saw that there seems to be some conflicting or mixed assessment on that part.
I don't know who. Andy, would you like to take that?
Yeah, I think just to double check, I understood the question, the successful use of satellite data and monitoring IUU activity. Yeah, I think that...
mixed success.
What's that, sorry?
Mixed success.
Yeah, that's right. I think that mixed success is a great expression. I think that there absolutely has been some good success, particularly in combination with assets, either in the air or on the water. And so using satellites to their advantage, which is being able to cover a large area of the ocean and help direct a limited number of assets to priority areas. I think that what's really important to look at with satellite data, well, that was exciting, with satellite data is that it's a rapidly growing area of capability. And so the number of satellites is growing, which in terms of looking at IUU fishing and monitoring, for example, sensitive marine areas, the resolution with which we can look at the ground, which basically means the smaller the boat that you can detect, and the more frequently that we can look at that area, so the coverage is rapidly increasing, which means that the value of satellite data as a technology for monitoring maritime activity is rapidly increasing. But the real benefits come in combination in an operational setting where you're using it in support with assets.
Okay, thank you. Another question just to round off before we end our session. Yes, sir.
Good evening. I'm Anirban Mukherjee from Qualcomm, and this question is to Mr. Narasimhamurthy. Sir, while ma'am spoke about Indian vessels going into Sri Lankan borders, but there is also illegal fishing going on in the Andamans. Other flag vessels come there. So how do you plan to tackle that, depletion of resources in India?
Yeah, this is the issue. Government of India level, many round of meetings has happened. We know not only, within the India, we are crossing the thing, India to neighboring states. There are many other countries also entering to our territorial and harvesting the things. It's happening. But yes, we have, marine policies under the preparations. So many things actually, our experts are suggested how to stop this. Vessels are coming. Vessels are entering into the Indian territorial waters, are harvesting things. So 2022, we have a marine policy bill. It's under preparation. In that, actually, we mentioned many things like how we can penalize that. Then what are the other illegal issues and all those things by avoiding, IUU. In addition to that, entering into the territorial waters also, it's a top priority for us. So the bill is under preparation. There are a lot of, suggestions already is underlying. Anytime we can come out with a marine policy bill in 2022. In that will include all these things. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've got time for another couple of questions, perhaps. Wes, the Quad agreed a plan this year to rein in illegal fishing, including China and Indo-Pacific. So this will include, better maritime surveillance. But how much can you really do to stop Chinese illegal fishing without coming into direct conflict with Chinese vessels?
So I think there's a couple of elements there that make that quite a difficult problem to solve. The first one I'd note is, we tend to talk about IUU fishing as though it's just one thing. There's an illegal fishing industry and they're out there doing the wrong thing. And we do need to recognise that almost all legitimate fishing fleets also suffer from IUU. There is underreporting in most fishing fleets around the world. There are instances of vessels fishing in areas that they're not supposed to, and so on. So it's not simply a case of being able to look at a fleet and say that's an IUU fleet and that's a good fleet. I think the other thing that we have to recognise is obviously there are a whole lot of sovereignty and boundary disputes in the region, and so what one country views as illegal fishing, another country views as domestic fishing. Yeah. And so it's very difficult, obviously, for to arbitrate on those kinds of things. But that doesn't change the fact that a basic increase to the level of scrutiny of that fishing will result in better practices. It will result in improvements and greater transparency of what's going on. And so, those efforts to increase maritime domain awareness really will pay dividends. And it gets to the point that was made earlier that transparency really does breed accountability. And so when I'll use myself as an example, when I'm making decisions about fisheries in Australia, the fact that those decisions will be published and the reasons for them will be published obviously creates, an environment where I need to make sure I can justify it. And when we're talking about surveillance in the Asia-Pacific area, obviously we're talking on a much grander scale, but I think the same principle applies.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Andy, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that it is the intertwined nature of fishing and broader maritime domain awareness is paramount. I think that you can't really separate them once you go beyond an artisanal fleet or even a domestic fleet, and you're dealing with high seas areas which, exactly as Wes said, they're not internationally agreed, and so the tools and methods of monitoring that get better, but it gets incredibly difficult to enforce, essentially.
This is one piece of a puzzle. Supply chain transparency is critical as well, which also requires technology and cooperation. Andy, how far along are we in terms of the journey in Asia? Where are we seeing progress, and who's really moving the needle on that issue?
I think that Wes said it before, across the Pacific, the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, kind of led by the foundation of the FFA, is really quite a progressive regional fishery management organisation. I mean, go back to the story that I talked about before. I mean, it's an indicative example, but it's all based on real activity, and it was a story of a vessel in one exclusive economic zone with the behaviour identified by an analyst there transiting the high seas into another economic zone with some other information that's been flagged by a port inspector in Micronesia. And that understanding of that vessel is enabled because of those data sharing policies. If you move over to the IOTC, they're on a journey to achieve that same sort of understanding through the data sharing. And ultimately, we want all regional fishery management organisations to get to a point where you can centrally understand the behaviour, not just within the EEZs of the RFMO, but across the high seas pockets. But absolutely, it's a journey. And I think that to say that we can confidently say where this can of tuna came from today is just not true.
Is that, we often talk about the role of the consumer in all of this. Is that a driving pressure? Is it driving enough pressure, or is it coming from board directors? We're seeing a lot more onus on company boards around these issues. They have to. It's not enough to say, "Oh, well, I didn't know that wasn't happening." We've seen some moves in Australia around trying to eradicate issues in human rights abuses in supply chains. Where is the pressure coming from? How can we sort of really turn the screw on this issue?
I think that it's a culmination of a whole lot of factors. Like, I think the work that Global Fishing Watch is doing is fantastic. I think that NGOs have a really important role to play. And then I think in the commercial sector, there is big changes in things like supermarket practices and large brands. I think Nestle recently has prevented fad fishing from going into pet food, if I recall correctly. And I think that these are driven by consumer demand. And I think, not dissimilar from the subsidies that we talked about being implemented, we need to work together to make sure we know. Yeah. How do we know that Molly's cat food didn't come from fad fishing during a closure period in the WCPFC region?
Yeah, absolutely, Paolo.
And I think while the oceans is a public good, so governments really do play such a critical, important part. But as to what's mentioned, and Andy, everybody has to play a role. It's the consumers, it's the supply chain, it's like the industry, it's everybody. And I know that we're running out of time, but I do want to highlight that technology, transparency, collaboration are important. But also another important piece is diversity. I do also want to be able to say that if there's 4 male in the panel, we won't be able to address this issue. We need to bring in diversity in all the conversations, especially in this topic, and especially in oceans.
Getting a chair there from the audience. I'll share with you. Perhaps we could have another question from our audience. Any more questions from our audience? No, we don't.
Can I just make a comment on
Yes,
on that last thread?
Yes, please.
One thing I've noticed in regional fisheries management organisations, and I've worked in WCPFC, IOTC and ICAT, so Indian Ocean, Atlantic Ocean and Central Pacific, is you have delegations from each country. They come along and they consist of government and the fishing industry. And one really key component that I haven't seen represented at many of those is the retail industry. They're a more direct representative of the consumer who's going to get this fish at the end of the day. And so I think it would be really interesting to see their influence coming in national delegations more. I know that's not really an IUU issue, but in terms of traceability and what consumers expect and what they'll pay for, I think it's an important thing.
I mean, where is this going to add a substantial cost to products, do you think? I mean, you're talking about vast amounts of technology, vast amount of capacity building. This isn't just sort of large fleets. You have to go all the way down to the smallest operator. This is going to cost a huge amount of money. Is that going to be translated then into supply chains and to the consumer?
Yeah, I think some of it has to.
Yeah.
And we've seen it in Australia, with eco-certification labels. Very worthwhile on high-value product, where you will be getting that market premium, either in the domestic market or the export market. But for low-value, high-volume products, much more difficult because there isn't the profit margins there in the catching sector to absorb additional costs. And there's not necessarily the interest in the consumers to absorb it either. So.
That's a good point to end on, I think. And thank you so much, Paolo, Wes, Andy, and Narasimha here dialing in virtually. Thank you so much for joining us today and for this for the great discussion, and thanks to our audience for tuning in. Please stay seated as we will have an interview with Minister Luhut, who will be live from Indonesia. Thank you so much.
Thank you.